Steve Cannane is a Europe correspondent for the ABC based in London. Prior to his posting, Steve was the host of The Drum, a reporter at Lateline and the author of First Tests, Great Australian Cricketers and the Backyards That Made Them.
You've read that, haven't you?
Yeah, cover. Totally. Years ago. It's on my shelf. It is actually on my father-in-law's shelf.
Oh, good. It is a Father's Day present.
I'm not making that up. But his new book is called Fair Game, The Incredible Untold Story of Scientology in Australia. Please join me in welcoming Steve Cannane.
Thank you.
Okay, so Steve, this book boasts characters with names like Spanky Taylor, Rex Beaver, Homer Shoma or Homer Skoma?
Homer Shoma.
Homer Shoma. Not to mention people like James Packer, Rupert and Lachlan Murdoch, Tom and Nicole, John Travolta, and of course Xenu or Xenu?
I would say Xenu.
Xenu. So it's like somebody gave me permission to read New Idea on steroids. On the surface, so it's tempting to be flippant about such an outlandish tale, but your book is a forensic breakdown of what is essentially a story of widespread family tragedy in a lot of ways, with a fair whack of it set in Australia. What initially drew you to this story?
Well, it was completely by accident. In the year 2010, I was working at Lateline as a reporter, and I really didn't know much about Scientology. And my colleague at Four Corners at the ABC, Quentin McDermott, had just done a fantastic program called The X-Files, which was about Scientology. And he had a couple of stories he hadn't been able to follow up. I'm not sure whether he couldn't squeeze them into the narrative of the story he was telling or whether he just did not have the time. But he passed these leads on to me, and so I followed them up, and they were quite amazing stories. One was about the daughter of the head of the Church of Scientology in Australia. The head of the Church of Scientology is Vicky Dunstan, and I spoke to her daughter Scarlett Hannah, who talked about growing up in Scientology. She described it as a toxic organisation. She said children brought up in the organisation were treated like cattle. The second story I did, and we ran them one night after the other, was about a woman called Carmen Rayner, who as an 11-year-old girl had been sexually abused by her stepfather, who was a Scientologist. And she said that she'd been coached by a very senior Scientologist to lie to police and community services about her abuse. So the stories were quite explosive, but the way the Church of Scientology reacted was incredibly over the top. They threatened to sue me. They threatened to injunct the program I worked on. They did everything during me putting the story together, anything they could to derail the process, and then they bombarded the ABC with complaints. And I just basically thought, geez, you guys have got a lot to hide, haven't you? Yeah. I'm going to keep looking into you. So I continued to do that, and I kept doing stories for Lateline, and I spoke to Mike Rinder, who grew up in Adelaide. He was the former head of the feared Office of Special Affairs in Scientology, and he was an international spokesman for Scientology for a long time. And he said that Australia was very significant in Scientology history, and the way he put it, he said, was the first country in the world to have an inquiry, a public inquiry into Scientology, which happened here in Victoria. The first country where there were bans on Scientology, that happened in Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia. Also, the first country where there was a High Court decision to declare that Scientology was a religion, which happened in 1983. And he also said that Australia was the first country where, across the board, journalists started to push back against Scientology intimidation tactics. And that happened from probably about 2008 onwards in Australia.
And then, of course, the history of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology's sort of first brush with Australia, extends even further back than that. When did he first sort of wash up on our shores?
L. Ron Hubbard came to Brisbane in 1942, serving with the US Naval Reserve. He tried very hard to join the US military, but they wouldn't accept him. He even got his local congressman to write him a note recommending him to the military, except that L. Ron Hubbard wrote it himself. He just got the stationery and wrote it says something like, I'm going off my memory, L. Ron Hubbard is one of the most remarkable men you will ever meet. So he wrote his own reference using someone else's stationery. He eventually got in the US Naval Reserve when basically it got to the point where they'd accept anybody. And L. Ron Hubbard came here in 1942. He only stayed for a couple of months. He would later claim that he helped save Australia from the Japanese. In fact, he was sent home for insubordination, owing money to a menswear store in Adelaide Street, Brisbane, and also owing a Thompson machine gun to the Australian military. L. Ron Hubbard also claimed that, don't get me started on L. Ron Hubbard's military record. L. Ron Hubbard also claimed that he was machine gunned in the back in the Javanese jungle by the Japanese, that he leapt onto a life raft and somehow made his way to 100 kilometres off the coast of West Australia. Now, I worked this out, that in that rubber life raft, he travelled 1,600 kilometres in shark-infested waters during the monsoon season. So it was quite an act. Now, of course, it never happened, and his personal nurse from 1975 to 1980, Kemar Douglas, says there was no sign whatsoever of wounds to his back, and if you look at his military record, he was not wounded during his service at all.
But that was the very beginning of him sort of building this mythology around himself, because didn't he credit Dianetics, which was his first sort of book and self-help type of manifesto, if you will.
Yeah.
He credited his healing from those sorts of injuries, he credited Dianetics.
That's right. He was at a military hospital, he claimed, and he said that after World War II, he was crippled and he was blinded. Now, and that he cured himself with these techniques that he taught himself, which became the best-selling book, Dianetics, in the early 1950s. Hubbard did not have any war wounds. He was not crippled or blinded, unless you count conjunctivitis, an ulcer.
Well, that can be pretty painful.
A sore hip, and some of the symptoms that you would associate with venereal disease as being war wounds. So he was not crippled, he was not blinded, he did not have war wounds. He said he had a Purple Heart because he was wounded in battle. He didn't. He said he had 27 war medals. He didn't. He had 4. Those 4 were the ones you get for turning up, not for any actual, valour.
Australians are a fairly, we like to think of ourselves as a fairly cynical bunch. So what kind of people were initially attracted to Dianetics in the 50s here in Australia?
All kinds of people, and this is one of the... I spent a fair bit of time in the Victorian Office of Public Records going through the transcripts of the Anderson inquiry, which was the public inquiry here from 1963 to 1965. There's 4 million words in the transcript. I didn't go through all of them, obviously, but you get a real snapshot of who these people were who were giving evidence in the inquiry. And there were people who were teachers, farmers. One guy was a beekeeper. All kinds of different people. But I think what probably united them was that they considered themselves free thinkers. They were looking for something different. They were looking for an alternative path. Somebody sent me an email and said that their father was involved in this group at the time, and that they were interested in all kinds of different things: alternative therapies, conspiracy theories, UFOs, things different from what the mainstream in Australia was delivering at the time, and some of them dabbled in Scientology.
So they were essentially well-meaning people.
Yeah.
And Scientology, of course, wasn't originally touted as a religion or sold as a religion.
No. It was when Hubbard released Dianetics, it was sold as a science of the mind.
And how was he reaching these people? Who was recruiting Australians at the time?
Okay, so what happened was Dianetics came out in the early 1950s. It only had an initial print run of 6,000, but it got a lot of momentum because of Joseph Campbell, who was the editor of Astounding Science Fiction, and he got on board and really plugged it. And so it became a New York Times bestseller, and it started to sell over here. And what happened is that people in Melbourne, in suburbs of Melbourne, set up little Dianetics virtual workshops where they would do Dianetic counselling with each other.
Moon Ponds, was that a bit of a hotbed of Scientology?
Yeah, around Essendon. Yeah, became the first Dianeticist. The first Dianeticist who set up shop there was a man called Darcy Hunt, and he was in Essendon. And I found a great article written in the Argus at the time of someone who visited Darcy Hunt. So started off as little backyard workshops. Then Darcy Hunt set up his Dianetics workshop. Then people used to meet at a building at Flinders Railway Station, and it grew. And in 1955, the first Scientology organisation was set up in Spring Street opposite the Parliament, and it was called the Hubbard Association of Scientologists International. It wasn't referred to as a church. And if you look at the literature, even Scientology publications until the 1960s, they were actively saying we are not a religion.
Hubbard was also originally very glowing about Australia and the potential in Australia. I think he said that Australia would become the first continent outside the US to go clear.
He thought it would become the first clear continent anywhere.
Yes.
Yes.
What did he mean by that? What does that mean?
Clear is a term in Scientology. At the time when Dianetics was released, clear was the highest level. Subsequently, it got up. You had all the operating Thetan levels where you would make more money out of them, or you would pay more money if you were going up Scientology's bridge. So by clear, it meant you were clear of these engrams in your body, and you had these superhuman capacity to, for example, have perfect memory. So he thought that all of Australia and all of Australians would embrace Scientology. Well, this is what he said. He may have just said it as a marketing technique, that he thought this may happen, that he thought that Australia would be the first continent in the world full of people who were clear.
And what about Hubbard himself? What was so appealing about him? He seems like a deeply unattractive man, but what was it about him that appealed to people? Well,
he was charismatic. He was a great storyteller. I don't mean that he wrote great books. I mean, orally, he was a great storyteller. He was able to hold an audience. So he spoke in Melbourne in 1959 at the Chevron Hotel. And people talk about, in the bamboo room, in fact, of the Chevron Hotel, and people talk about how, he could hold a crowd. He was charismatic. He would tell jokes and spin yarns. And I guess that there were people looking for something. They were looking for alternatives. And he provided an alternative way of thinking. It must be said, too, he never had mass appeal. I don't know what the peak of Scientology numbers were, but certainly at the moment, in the last census, there's 2,163 people in Australia who declared themselves Scientologists. So it was never, even though they claim they're the fastest growing religion, it's never been a movement that's had mass appeal. So it's appealed to certain people. It
appealed to a small but perhaps sort of influential group of people. I mean, it had quite an impact quite early on. Part of that, many people say that L. Ron Hubbard was just a genius marketer. He was very, very good at marketing. And of course, many Australians ended up in upper roles or roles in upper management in Scientology, including Mike Rinder, who you mentioned before, who became the official spokesperson for Scientology. And then one of the particularly brilliant marketing moves was to set up the Celebrity Centre and to start to court celebrities.
Yeah.
And that was the brainchild of an Australian woman, is that right?
That's right, Yvonne Gillam, who was originally a Brisbane kindergarten teacher, but she set up a college of Scientology in Melbourne with her husband, Peter Gillam, and they were real pioneers of Scientology. And Hubbard in 1955 wrote a memo called Project Celebrity, where he talked about how it would be a really good thing to recruit celebrities because the marketing potential would be, sensational.
And who were some of the celebrities on that
list? It was a great list. The people who would never sign up to Scientology. Groucho Marx. Yeah. Liberace, Billy Graham. Why would Billy Graham sign up to Scientology?
He just liked the challenge.
Greta Garbo was another one on that list.
Walt Disney?
Edward R. Murrow, that fine journalist with one of the most finely honed bullshit detectors in the 20th century, was on that list as well. So it was quite a list. Yeah. None of those people, Bob Hope was another one. None of those people were ever recruited to Scientology. So Hubbard identified that as an issue, but Yvonne Gillam came from a very different place. She set up the Celebrity Centre in the late 1960s. It was her idea. She'd been working in Los Angeles selling Scientology services, trying to recruit people, and she just loved artists and creative types. And she believed in Scientology, and she wanted to help these people. And she ended up being actively involved with John Travolta and helping him. At one point, Yvonne was trying to recruit Elvis to Scientology as well.
He would have been ripe for the picking around that time.
Priscilla got involved. So, Elvis needed some help, but...
Because what was it about celebrities that made them quite vulnerable to the Scientology cell?
Well, I think with the acting profession, you've got a kind of perfect storm for... Scientology likes to find L. Ron Hubbard used to say, find the ruin of somebody, find their weakness, find the spot that you can recruit them in. And actors work in an environment where there's very little work. They're looking for whatever edge they can get to get that job. They're quite emotionally vulnerable, needy. Sorry, Reese. Sometimes quite needy people. I'll be helping you out later. And often can, be looking for that extra edge. And in fact, I talk about in the book Footballers in a very similar place. Very small employment opportunities, cutthroat world of getting employment, looking for the edge. So I just think that the actors, in particular Californian actors, were ripe for Scientology.
So as this sort of movement was building in LA and around these celebrities, and it was starting to quite gather momentum back in Melbourne as well, you mentioned Edward R. Murrow's bullshit detector before. Rupert Murdoch had a good bullshit detector as well, didn't he? Yes.
In 2012, Rupert Murdoch tweeted, Scientology is a very weird cult. And this was in relation to Katie Holmes and Tom Cruise breaking up. And people were thinking, why is Rupert Murdoch tweeting about Scientology? Why? Most media proprietors were running scared from Scientology because Time Warner, obviously big rivals to Rupert Murdoch, had been sued for $400 million in the 1990s for their Time magazine expose called A Thriving Cult of Greed and Power. Scientology lost that case, but it cost Time Warner a lot of money. It dragged on for 10 years. So everyone was a bit perplexed why Rupert was tweeting about Scientology, but it goes back to the 1960s. And Rupert inherited the Adelaide News, then he bought the Perth Sunday Times, and he wanted to crack a big market and buy a newspaper in a big city, and he bought the Daily Mirror in Sydney. And with the Daily Mirror, he got The Truth. Now, there might be some people in this room who remember The Truth. It was a scandal sheet that reported racing form, a lot of stories about showgirls, and also a lot of divorce court stuff, pre-no-fault divorce. There were some great stories to be told in the divorce courts, and Truth specialised in those tales. And I loved going through the microfiche of Truth, I've got to say. So Rupert... Truth in the 60s in Melbourne was crusading against Scientology, at all times referring to it as bunkumology. And those particular newspaper articles, I wouldn't say led to the inquiry, but they put it on the public agenda and certainly was part of the process that ended up leading to that inquiry. So Rupert Murdoch was very supportive of what The Truth was doing. Then in in the late 1960s, the Daily Mirror was also crusading against Scientology.
Rupert, we know, likes a private investigator.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about his collaboration with Rex, the aforementioned Rex Beaver?
Okay, so I was looking through the Hansards for the New South Wales Parliament to work out why Scientology was not banned in New South Wales. I wanted to see what the debates were going on at the time. And I found this great little exchange where a local Liberal MP in Sydney tabled a statutory declaration by private investigator Rex Beaver. Now, I just thought, Rex in this statutory declaration said that he'd been hired by the Scientologists to spy on 11 parliamentarians, clergymen, psychologists, psychiatrists, the journalist Anne Deveson, and Rupert Murdoch. And I just thought that if Rex Beaver was still alive, I'd be able to find him because there aren't many Rex Beavers in the world. So anyway, I've worked out through cross-checking electoral rolls and white pages and various things that he lived in Auburn at the time, and then I looked up the phone in Sydney, and I looked up the phone book, and there was 3 Beavers in Auburn. Mm-hmm. Now, the way I recently told this to a defamation lawyer in London, and then when I told him this story, he said, "So you've looked up every Beaver in Auburn." Which is true. I did do that, and I rang them up and I left messages on their answering machines. And a week later, I get a phone call. "G'day, it's Rex Beaver here." And I was just so excited that Rex was alive, that he'd found me, that he'd called me back. And I said, "Rex, the reason I want to talk to you is that I want to talk to you about a case you worked on 45 years ago, and you may not remember it. It's about Scientology. And then there's this lengthy pause, and he says, how could I forget it? Now, Rex not only did not forget this case, Rex kept exhaustive files. He had his statutory declaration from 1968. He had his notebooks from 1968. He had his group certificate and his payslips, which are in the book. Because the Church of Scientology now hires private investigators at arm's length, so they can have plausible deniability. But then they hired Rex Beaver, and so Rex went into the Church of Scientology in Sydney after answering an advertisement in the Daily Telegraph. They put him on the cans, on the e-meter, and they started interrogating him, asking him questions like, are you a homosexual? Have you ever been a communist? All these strange questions that they ask as part of a security check. Anyway, Rex, in his words, decided they were a bunch of ratbags, that he'd take their money to spy on Rupert Murdoch, but he'd go and see Rupert and see if Rupert wanted him to act as a double agent.
Nice.
So Rupert, of course, loved the idea. So he had to keep pretending that he was spying on Rupert Murdoch. So Rupert gave him little bits of information like where his boat was moored, where he lived, little bits of information. So it looked like Rex was still gleaning information about Rupert. And so then he spied on the Scientologists for Rupert, fed all this information to Rupert, and then 2 weeks later, the Sunday Daily Mirror was ready to splash with the story of Rex Beaver being hired to spy on Rupert Murdoch and all these politicians.
And didn't Rupert actually offer to help Rex by coming out of it, setting up?
He did. According to Rex, Rupert said, "Do you want me to mock up a photo with me leaving a motel with my secretary?"
Yeah, very helpful.
And Rex said that won't be required. Thanks,
Rex
Rupert.
was more estranged than Rupert Murdoch.
Though Rex was a divorce specialist. Rex was one of those guys who he told me he did over 2,000 cases where pre-no-fault divorce you had to have evidence that your partner was cheating on you. So Rex was the guy who used to jump out of the cupboard, surprise, and take photos in the moment of passion and then run out the door. Rex said he was shot at, he had many milk bottles thrown at him. I think he once got stuck going in a bathroom window and couldn't get out. So Rex had a pretty interesting life.
I think Rex should be your next book.
I think so, yeah.
But we'll move on from Rex. On a bit more of a serious note, let's go back to the Anderson inquiry, which you've mentioned, which was the first inquiry of its kind into Scientology in the world. And when it was initially announced, local Scientologists initially celebrated the fact that there was going to be an inquiry. Why?
I still don't know why they did celebrate it. And I got copies of cables urging the inquiry, and they put a sign up saying thank you. I don't know why they thought an inquiry was a good idea. I think maybe they thought that all mental health services would be put under the microscope, but the inquiry was only ever going to be about Scientology. Maybe they thought that the techniques of Scientology were so fantastic that under an inquiry that would come out of how good it was. But of course that did not happen. I mean, in the end, Anderson gave a damning report where he described Scientology as evil, and that of course led to that ban in Victoria.
Was it a fair inquiry? I mean, shouldn't people be free to worship whoever they want to worship?
I agree with that, though at that point I would not use the term worship, I would use the term belief, because I think they believed in Scientology, but I don't think they were worshipping. I don't think the people who were involved in Scientology back then really considered it to be a religion. But I think the inquiry was fair in that Scientologists got a right to be heard. There were dozens of Scientologists testified, but Scientologists told me that they didn't think it was fair because of the questions they were asked by Anderson. It was a one-man inquiry. It was called the Board, but it was really Kevin Anderson QC running it. Roger Boswava, who was a former Scientologist and thinks Scientology is a scam, thinks the Scientologists got a raw deal. But then Malcolm Macmillan, who was is a psychologist, and he attended every day of the inquiry. He thinks they did get a fair deal. So you get two viewpoints. I think Anderson was a bit over the top with his criticisms. Anderson was raised a Catholic pre the Vatican II reformations, and I think that there's a tone of moralism about Anderson that in the modern day you feel a bit uncomfortable about. You know, there's sections in there where he talks about sexual perversion and moral laxity and things like that. I mean, I think he was right to point out how people had been swindled by Scientology, but even the term evil is such a loaded emotional term. I think there were aspects about it that were over the top, and I also think the ban was ridiculous. I think that you can't... and Jack Galbally, who was one of the main... he was the leader of the Labor Party in the upper house in Victoria at the time, and he was... really getting up in Parliament and criticising Scientology. He was very much against the ban. He wanted some kind of form of consumer regulation, like an ombudsman who could look into fringe practices, and if someone was ripped off, that they could get a form of justice. I actually can't fault that idea. But to ban it, to send it underground, I think was counterproductive.
Yeah, what were the implications of that ban?
Well, around 100 Scientologists left Victoria and moved to the UK and to St Hill, where Hubbard's Manor was, which financially benefited Hubbard. Also, hypnosis was banned in Victoria under the Psychological Practices Act. And this really pissed off Malcolm Macmillan, the psychologist that I mentioned before, because he had started to do some research into the area. I mean, one of the ridiculous things about the bans after the Anderson inquiry is that I don't think they actually arrested and successfully charged any Scientologists, but some stage hypnotists got into trouble. Like, really? Like stage hypnotists?
Wow.
So that also, there was Peter Gillam ran some e-meters over the border to Adelaide in a kind of undercover operation. And people were practicing Scientology in their own home. But then you had this crazy situation where police were raiding homes where people were practicing Scientology, but they had to show evidence that they were practicing. So you might see an e-meter there, but if someone's not holding the cans while the wallopers turn up, well, where's the evidence? It's a bit like kind of raiding one of those old casinos and you can see the roulette table, but no one's on it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was really preposterous that the police were involved in doing this kind of thing.
And did it, in a way, help to push Scientology from being a science into a religion? In a roundabout way?
Yeah, I think so, because around about this time there were other challenges. The FDA did a raid on Scientology in Washington, and there's a memo that I got my hands on that Hubbard sent to Australia, and it said basically get church written on the buildings, like the HASI, the Hubbard Association, Scientologists International, get people to wear dog collars, get people to start referring to themselves as ministers. So you could use religion as a cloak to protect Scientology. So that ban, the raids in the US certainly had an influence on how Scientology referred to itself. And at one point they started referring to themselves in Australia as the Church of New Faith. And that came after these bans started taking place, and you saw challenges starting to happen to the ban on a religious basis, and the people lobbying and writing letters started referring to themselves as reverend and the like, which they weren't doing before.
And you also write that Hubbard learnt from the experience in Victoria, because he was initially reluctantly willing to cooperate with the inquiry, but after this experience in Victoria and in response to a potential UK inquiry, he wrote, "Never agree to an investigation of Scientology. Start feeding lurid blood, sex crime, actual evidence on the attackers to the press. Don't ever tamely submit to an investigation of us. Make it rough on attackers all the way."
Yeah.
What were some of their tactics?
Well, he set up, this is where the Guardian's office comes into place, which was their private investigation unit. Initially, Hubbard decided to use private investigators, but one of the problems was that private investigators like Rex Beaver would be hired and then didn't like working with them, and they would blab to the press or Rex's case, go to the local MP. And that happened in the UK. So then he decided not to hire private investigators at that point and set up his own intelligence wing, the Guardian's office. So he started to, basically try and seek revenge on his critics. He said this, he talked about this kind of thing back in 1959 in his Manual of Justice. And you can see him talking about seeking revenge on critics, but they start forming an apparatus where they can basically spy on people. You start to see Scientology policy change as a result of what happens in Australia. And then you also start to see in the UK, the Anderson report referred to quite a lot. And one of the reasons that happened was there was a journalist called Alex Mitchell who was Australian, grew up in Townsville, started on the Mount Isa Times, then worked at Rupert's Daily Mirror in Sydney. And he took copies of the Anderson report over to the UK when he went over to work for the Sunday Times. And he distributed them around the bars, around Fleet Street. The journalists got their hands on them. Whenever there were reports on Scientology, they quoted Anderson saying Scientology was evil. And then this started to be raised in the House of Commons. And then Hubbard's under increased pressure, and that leads to Hubbard eventually being exiled from the UK and setting up the Sea Organisation and going onto the high seas, cruising around the Mediterranean. So you really see the influence that Australia played on Hubbard, him going into exile, their policies getting heavier.
Then, of course, there's the element of high-profile Australians signing on as Scientologists. James Packer being one of those people. Scientology worked pretty well for James, didn't it?
It appears to be the case. At one point, James's father, Kerry, a man notoriously sceptical of all forms of religion or belief, except maybe the pursuit of money and that all tax inspectors are assholes. He thought that Scientology helped James. Friends said that. Marty Rathbun, former Scientologist who was second in charge of Scientology and was heavily involved in auditing James and helping him to stay in Scientology for a while. He claimed it helped him. So it seems like James was at a very low point. It was 2001, 2002, the OneTel crash. He'd lost a lot of his family company's money. The Murdochs had invested $400 million in OneTel and they'd lost that. James was at a very low point. He was depressed. His father was quite cruel to him about how things went with OneTel. So he was at a low point, and Tom Cruise reached out a hand and suggested he get involved in Scientology.
And you write that Tom Cruise had good intentions. He genuinely wanted to help James. He saw that James was hurting, but there was another motive behind recruiting James Packer, wasn't there?
Yeah, they wanted to get to Lachlan Murdoch. And the reason they want to get to Lachlan Murdoch is to get revenge on Rupert Murdoch. So Marty Rathbun, the former second in charge, said that he, Tom Cruise, David Miscavige all agreed that it would be this coup of all coups to get Lachlan Murdoch into Scientology. Marty used the term getting our claws into News Corp. If they could recruit the man who'd helped trigger the inquiry and the ban, that this would be this great moment of revenge for Scientology. Now, Marty Rathbun in 1981 went through what he described as the conspiracy files in Scientology's headquarters, and that he saw all these files where it said that Rupert Murdoch was considered this kind of evil overlord and part of a conspiracy theory involving pharmaceutical companies and banks to destroy Scientology. So getting Lachlan to get back at Rupert became a bit of a priority. Now, there's no indication whatsoever that James knew about this or was involved in it, and certainly Lachlan was not recruited. At one point, he was quoted in the Daily Beast. He was asked what he thought of Scientology, and he said, "I share my father's views without tweeting about them."
Nice. So, I mean, James took what he needed from it and says that, and it helped him at a tough time, but he left relatively unscathed. The same couldn't be said for Nicole Kidman. She was labelled an SP. What does that mean? That's
a suppressive person. They're considered enemies of Scientology. Hubbard described them as antisocial. Nicole's story in Scientology is very interesting because she actually was Tom got into Scientology. I'll go back to this beginning. Tom got involved in Scientology because he fell in love with Mimi Rogers. He married her. Mimi Rogers was involved in Scientology because her father had set up a Scientology mission. Now, these were allowed under the days of Hubbard, but when Miscavige took over, he crushed the missions because he wanted central control of Scientology. So Tom was in Scientology. David Miscavige is happy about that, but it's like he's involved in the wrong brand. So they help kill off the relationship between Mimi Rogers and Tom Cruise. Marty Rathbun and L. Ron Hubbard's former personal lawyer delivered the divorce papers to Mimi Rogers. Marty Rathbun also said that they encouraged the relationship between Tom and Nicole, but later on they found out that Nicole was the daughter of a prominent Sydney psychologist, Anthony Kidman, and he is a suppressive person because he's a psychologist, or was a psychologist, and that makes Nicole, in Scientology lingo, a potential trouble source because she's close to the suppressive person. So they've got a problem. So then a man called Greg Wilhare, who at the time was second in charge of Scientology, Marty Rathbun subsequently replaced him, was apparently told to sow a seed in Tom's head that Nicole was the wrong person. And Miscavige told him this, according to the story. And Wilhare apparently does this. Tom Cruise gets outraged because he's in love with Nicole and besotted by him, and then goes back to Miscavige and says, he's telling me that Nicole's the wrong person. And so Miscavige, the guy who delivered the orders, then demotes Wilhare for doing what he was meant to do, which is sow the seed in Tom's head about Nicole. So then they decide, okay, well, the only way around this is to get Nicole involved into Scientology. So when Tom and Nicole get married, it's a Scientology wedding. It's overseen by a Scientology auditor, Ray Mithoff. Sea Org chefs do the catering. In the end, for a few months, Nicole moves into the international base inside the compound in California, where Sea Organisation staff live, and she goes up to operating Thetan Level 2. So she gets involved. But at a certain point, she decides it's not for her. And Marty Rathbun actually had to deliver the course, which is known as the Suppressive Person Potential Trouble Source course, to Nicole Kidman. And within that course, he would have had to said something along the lines that psychology is evil, psychologists are evil. Now, that would not have gone down well with Nicole. She was very close to her father. She loved him very much. And also, Nicole came from a family of critical thinkers. Her mother was a member of the Women's Electoral Lobby. They were campaigning against the Vietnam War. Her father used to hand out how to vote cards for the Labor Party with Nicole. They were a political family. They talked about justice, human rights issues around the dinner table. The alarm bells would have been going off for her. And at that point, sometime after that point, she got Tom to drift from Scientology for a period of about 5 years, from 1993 to 1998. This apparently drove David Miscavige nuts. They were also shooting more films overseas. They were spending more time in Australia. And Tom would occasionally turn up to an event. He did a one-off auditing session in 1996. Then Marty Rathbun got Tom Cruise back in 1998 to do about a week's worth of auditing. Now, even though Nicole had basically got Scientology out of the relationship, Tom's personal assistant was a man called Michael Doven, who was a Scientologist. And Mike Rinder and Marty Rathbun both told me that basically he was paid for by Tom Cruise, but he took his orders from Miscavige. So they've got a spy in their house reporting back what Nicole thinks about Scientology to Scientology headquarters. Marty Rathbun told me that from 1998, Doven was told to plant a seed, that term again, plant a seed in Tom's head that Nicole is not right for, that the relationship, was not right. And so fast forward for 3 years later, in about January 2001, Michael Doven calls Church of Scientology, says Tom wants a divorce. Around about this time, anyone who's seen Going Clear will remember the exchange where Marty Rathbun talks about Tom wanting Nicole's phone to be wiretapped, and apparently Miscavige said, "God damn it, get it done." And certainly I found evidence from my research that there was some kind of tapping of her phone, and that people were hired to sweep her place for bugs because she knew what was going on. But they couldn't find any, and that's because in the end they discovered that the phone was being tapped at the telephone exchange. So after that, after the divorce, I've been told that the children were indoctrinated that their mother was a suppressive person. Leah Remini has said this. John Brousseau told me that he started to hear the children and he looked after the children while Tom was being audited, that he heard the children when they were quite young saying this kind of thing. So somebody's put it into their head. The Church of Scientology, of course, denies it, but other people say that there is evidence of it.
And that's a very public case of a very common Scientology tactic, which is to separate families from each other.
Yeah, there's a policy called disconnection where members who leave Scientology and are declared suppressive people can't see their family members again. Mike Rinder, who I've mentioned tonight, he can't. When he left, he walked out the door in the UK. He couldn't see his wife again. He couldn't see his children again. He couldn't see his mother again. His mother was a senior woman, probably in her 80s at that time, living in Victoria. She had to make a choice. Does she continue to talk to Mike, or does she continue to talk to Mike's brother? Now, Mike at the time was living in the US. His brother was living in Victoria, and his children were living in Victoria. So she would have, if she decided to keep seeing Mike, she would have been cut off from her other son and her grandchildren. So she had to make a choice about who she saw. So it's a diabolical policy that tears families apart, and it's just unjustifiable.
Another figure in the media Australian figure who proved to be a thorn in the side of Scientology is a person by the name of Julian Assange. I think we've got time. Can you please read the email that Julian Assange sent out to his, I don't know, we'd call them followers?
The cyber punks email list it was.
What year was this?
This is the late 1990s. Julian Assange had just avoided a sentence for jail sentence for hacking. He'd been hacking into NASA and other US institutions at the time. And do you want me to set it up a bit about the history?
Sure.
Okay, so what happened was there was a university student in Melbourne at the time called David Gerard, and this is in the early days of the internet, and they had these things called Usenet groups, and people would get on. They were kind of like bulletin boards, and they discussed topics. And there was one that became particularly famous called alt.religion.scientology. And people started to post secret scriptures of Scientology, or ex-members would tell secrets about Scientology. And this became a real problem for the Church of Scientology because it's basically a Cold War religion set up under a kind of a command and control model where they keep secrets and they have surveillance. But the internet explodes all that. They can't keep their secrets anymore because people are posting stuff. And so David Gerard was this university student in Melbourne, and he was posting things on alt.religion.scientology, and lawyers for the Church of Scientology in California wrote to the university in Melbourne. It was the Victorian University of Technology at the time, and said, unless you stop this student from using your computers to post this information, we're going to sue the university. And the university, to their shame, put pressure on Gerard to stop doing this. And he just thought, bugger you guys, I'm going to set up an anti-Scientology website. So he had to find somebody to host this. And somebody said, there's this guy called Julian Assange who runs a non-profit ISP called suburbia.net. And he went and met Assange, or spoke to Assange, and said, look, this could cause you a world of pain, but it's probably going to be a lot of fun. And Assange just basically said, yep, I'm on board. I'm in. So Assange, being the kind of person he is, he ended up wanting to find out more information about the Church of Scientology. So he ends up doing a whole lot of reading about them, and he sends out this email. It was on the 15th of March 1996, and he's urging free speech advocates to attend a rally outside the Church of Scientology in Melbourne. So I'll just cut in halfway through. He says, by the time a devotee of the church has realised the highest OT level, the church has usually had them for over 5 figures. But revenue isn't the only reason for keeping the works of Rons occulted away. A common technique used by cults to brainwash their followers is gradual immersion in cult mythology and philosophy. To put it bluntly, it is often advisable to keep the more wacko beliefs and practices out of your new recruits' faces until they are sufficiently wacko themselves. Now, the problem for the Church of Scientology is that on the wacko scale, the higher level works of Ron hover somewhere near the figure 10. To an outsider, it is an immediate farce. But to a follower who's become psychologically dependent on the Church's philosophy and society and invested thousands and thousands of dollars in doing so, it's just another step on the road to mental subservience. What you have then is a church based on brainwashing yuppies and other people with more money than sense. This may not concern you. If Nicole Kidman, Kate Sobrano, John Travolta, Bruce Willis, Demi Moore, neither of those two were involved, by the way, but anyway.
Think so.
And Tom Cruise want to spend their fortunes on learning that the Earth is in reality the destroyed prison colony of aliens from out of space, then so be it. However, money brings power and attracts the corrupt. Money is something the church has a lot of. Not all of the church's beliefs and practices are so out of it as to be completely as irrelevant as the previous example. Some are quite insidious. For instance, L. Ron Hubbard devised a range of methods that could be used against critics other than enemies of the church. Among the list was manipulation of the legal court system, and to the church, the battle isn't won in the courtroom. It is won at the very moment the legal process starts unfolding, creating fear and expense in those the church opposes. Their worst critic at the moment is not a person or an organisation, but a medium, the internet. The internet is by its very nature a censorship-free zone. Censorship, concealment and revelation for a fee is the church's raison d'etre. The church, via its manipulation of the legal system, has had computer systems seized, system operators forced to reveal their user personal details, university accounts suspended, and radio stations such as Triple R cut their programs. It has sued ex-cult members, newspapers and many others for copyright infringements, loss of earnings and trade secret violation. Trade secret violations? Yes. The Church of Scientology claims its religious works are trade secrets. The fight against the church is far more than the net versus a bunch of wackos with too much money. It is about corporate suppression of the internet and free speech. It is about intellectual property and the big and rich versus the small and smart. The precedent the church sets today, the weapons of corporate tyranny for tomorrow. So that's Assange in 1996. And you can see some of the themes that he's continued throughout his... And just as a little postscript of that, they threatened to sue him after David Gerard posted 4 lines of these secretive OT levels. 12 years later, Julian Assange sets up WikiLeaks. And within 12 months, one of the things he does is post all 612 pages of the secret OT levels online through WikiLeaks.
And the implications of that are extraordinary because as Assange points out there, a Scientology member would pay to reach each new level until they would literally open a suitcase and read about Xenu. And some of them would say what the...
Yeah, and Paul Haggis talks about that in Going Clear. That's right. And so suddenly the internet kills that business model because if those secrets are out there, you know, you can't suppress that and, the mystique is gone.
So has the internet broken psychology?
Yeah.
Scientology, I mean?
It has. It's killed its business model, not only through making its scripture, if you call it that, its secret scripture public, but every horror story, they can't control journalism like they used to be able to. You know, their legal suits used to have a chilling effect, but now... You know, what would happen is something like Time magazine would splash, it'd cause a problem for them for a little while and people would move on. But now if you're an 18-year-old who wants to dabble in Scientology, go online and have a look and you see every horror story of abuse that's happened in the last 20 years. Not only that, but people who were in the bubble of Scientology have had a sneaky look on the internet and they may have had thoughts that something was wrong and suddenly they get exposed to that and that's helped drag them out. So on so many levels, the internet has killed their model.
Can they recover?
No, I don't think they can. They're recruiting hardly anyone in Australia now. They're relying now on Taiwan as a ground to recruit and they fly people in on religious worker visas. So in some countries like that, perhaps, but in Western countries, they're not recruiting people anymore.
So they're following the Philip Morris model, in a way.
Except they're not being taxed.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, because their membership may be diminishing, but their wealth certainly isn't, is it?
Well, Mike Rinder told me they had $2 billion in the bank. And that's why you see them opening buildings. That's the only way they can pretend that they're being successful. They claim they're the fastest growing religion, but they're really going backwards. But they're opening new buildings. To me, it's like a fourth division football team building an MCG and no one turns up.
Yeah.
You know, no one's inside. They have these flash buildings, but there's no one there.
What will be the thing that eventually completely breaks them? Is it a matter of someone like John Travolta or Tom Cruise finally seeing the light?
If Cruise left, that'd be pretty devastating for them. The next big step is what happens, how long can David Miscavige hang on for? What happens if he dies? Could there be a reformation within Scientology? A reformation in Scientology is very difficult because L. Ron Hubbard is the source. So whatever he said, all these crazy things about revenge and punishment, you know, it's a fundamentalist religion. They don't budge from what has been written by Hubbard. So it's hard to see how they can have a reformation. It'd be hard to think they could have a more totalitarian leader than Miscavige, and certainly Miscavige has driven the exodus in recent years due to his policies. But I just can't see them being out. I think they've had their moment. If all those stories I was telling you about L. Ron Hubbard before, if he came on the scene now, he'd be exposed. But hang on, if we talk about Donald Trump, maybe...
Okay, let's not go there. That'll be another 2 hours. It will melt our minds. So instead, let's throw to the audience. We've got a couple of roving mics, so please put your hand up very high and one of our people will find you. Who have we got?
Hi, Steve.
Hi.
A lot of what we hear about Scientology are these more preposterous stories or anecdotes and people coming out having left. I'm curious, in your research, have you come across anyone that in any way convincingly has sort of extolled the virtues or the benefits of it in any meaningful way?
Okay, I should say that no one from the Church of Scientology officially would talk to me for this book. None of the leadership. When I asked for interviews with certain people who were Scientologists, they would not put forward people. I've had conversations with people who do extol the virtues of Scientology, that they say it's made them more confident, that it's improved their lives. So yes, people have told me that. One person in the book I spoke to people one guy, Roger Meadmore, who's been a lifelong Scientologist, who said L. Ron Hubbard was one of the greatest human beings in the last 5,000 years. He said it improved his IQ, improved his businesses. I also spoke to Ron Siegel, who's been a Scientologist for 50 years. Similar story. He believes it's made him a better person and that Hubbard is a genius. So yes, there are the people who I spoke to who were Scientologists think it works. They talk about the technology working.
I'm not sure whether this came up in any of the research that you did, but what's your take on the location of David Miscavige's wife?
Yeah, now I'm not an expert on this. Tony Ortega, who's a New York journalist and writes about Scientology every day, has got the answer to this if you look on his blog. It's not something I really went into, so I'd prefer not to answer that question except to point you to, certainly she's not been seen in public for a very long time. And Leah Remini, the actress who's recently written a book about Scientology, at a wedding, I think it was one of Tom Cruise's weddings, said, "Where is Shelley?" And confronted David Miscavige about this, and this was considered outrageous. People have flown over a Scientology building with a plane with a little ticker saying, "Where's Shelley Miscavige?"
Really?
So apparently someone reported to the police investigated it, nothing's come of that. But yeah, she hasn't been seen in public for a very long time, but I'd point you to what Tony Ortega's written about that.
Just while we wait for the next person, are you surprised by how many secrets can still be kept in the age of the internet when it comes to Scientology?
Yeah, it's very hard to keep secrets. It is, and even like mailing lists, things that go out on Scientology mailing lists suddenly make it online.
Yeah.
I think information leaks out all the time, or people record stuff inside the Church of Scientology and leak it, often leaking it to Tony Ortega. All those documents, they're all online. So if you're a researcher, you can go and see a lot of that stuff. What you described before, the secret stuff in the briefcase, you can see that online. So it's very hard in the age of internet to control this information. The classic case of that too is the Tom Cruise video where he's in the black turtleneck jumper, where he's talking about how good Scientology is, and if only a Scientologist could intervene at a traffic accident and to make a difference. Well, that was an internal Scientology video that leaked online. Yeah. And the Church of Scientology once again tried to censor that and stop that being online, and that led to the rise of Anonymous. So it's that classic thing where they try and, in the age of the internet, shut something down, but it causes outrage amongst all the free speech advocates, and it causes them more trouble than it's worth.
It's really hard to start a religion these days. Down the back?
Steve, Reese, non-troubled actor. Just a quick question. Would you describe the auditing process? And I also think of this in sort of political life. Would you describe the auditing process and the way that auditing is used and all the questions about personal life and all that? Is it a blackmail model that essentially you're handing over every personal secret that you might have to an organisation, and then they can keep charging you to not reveal that secret in a similar way that where you look at, often observing British politics, I think, is just who has the most skeletons and who has the most stuff on the next guy, which keeps that sort of game rolling along. But do you think that the auditing is basically a blackmail model of business?
I don't know if it was designed in that way, but in practice it certainly works that way. And many people I've spoken to said that information has come out about them there's no other way it could have come out except if someone had accessed their auditing files. So just to explain, when you do auditing, the auditor asks you very personal questions, often explicit questions about sex, sexual practices, sexual partners, maybe your drug-taking past, for example. So you have all these records of information that you would not want to get out. And it is ripe for blackmail. And, the Church of Scientology says, well, they respect what goes on in auditing as, like the Catholic Church would confession. But in practice, that does not happen. And, it's a perceived threat too. People think, well, I've said all these things. And even if anyone doesn't say anything to you, you think, well, what happens? What happens if I do leave?
And it is recorded, isn't it? I mean, people have reams and reams of files on themselves.
Yeah, massive, what they call pre-clear folders. Yeah. In Going Clear, Tom de Vocht, I think it was, talked about how David Miscavige had been listening to Tom Cruise's auditing and was laughing about them and joking about his sexual experiences. So, if that's true, that's a massive, invasion of people's personal rights and personal space.
And there's a theory that that's what keeps John Travolta.
Yeah, I've heard that theory that, he feels like that's held over him. I don't know if that's true or not, but I've certainly heard that a number of times.
Do we have any more questions? We do.
Steve, do you expect to be sued?
Well, I've done around about 10 or 11 stories for Lateline, and almost all the time they threaten to sue me. So far they haven't sued me. I got a couple of legal letters in the lead up to this book threatening to sue me. So far they haven't sued me. I don't know if they're going through the book with a fine-tooth comb yet. Church of Scientology has had an interesting couple of responses to the book in the last week. One was a statement to the Daily Mail that likened my book to a hate crime. And they said something like that the errors are too numerous to mention or something like that. But then another statement came out to A Current Affair which said they hadn't read the book. So I don't know how they worked out it was like a hate crime or not. Anyway, I don't know if they'll sue me or not. They haven't sued for a long time.
But they have other methods that they use against journalists.
Yeah, they certainly use private investigators.
Have you ever experienced any of those tactics?
I haven't. Brian Seymour from Channel 7 have had the whole, people coming up to him with video cameras in his face. Paulette Cooper in the 1970s in New York, they tried to frame her for a bomb hoax, which would have landed her in jail for a number of years. They
very nearly succeeded, didn't they?
Yeah.
Got quite close.
Yeah, she got cleared because the FBI raided the Church of Scientology on another matter, which is Operation Snow White, which is where they were stealing tens of thousands of documents from the tax department, the Department of Justice. So that she got lucky that they found the policy to frame her in their files. They also leafleted her apartment block, her whole apartment block in New York City, saying that she was a prostitute with venereal disease who molested children. So what they did to Paulette Cooper was a disgrace, and they have never apologised for it. And they now say, oh, well, that was some rogue unit that got disbanded. Well, they've never come out and apologised to her, and in fact, they ended up spying on her for about 40 years. So Paulette Cooper is an incredibly courageous woman, and her book was one of the first to lift the lid on Scientology. I don't think they behave like that now with journalists. But they certainly, Tony Ortega had his emails hacked by a private investigator a couple of years ago. So they still try it on. Well, someone's trying it on. Yeah.
We've got time for one more question, if it's out there.
What is it that they claim makes them a religion?
They don't believe in a God. They believe in reincarnation. They believe in coming back. Look, my attitude to it is if someone calls something a religion, that's fine by me. If you're a Rastafarian and you say that's my religion, to me that's your personal choice. Or same with if you're one of the Jedi Knights who've been calling themselves Jedi Knights and you honestly think that's your religion, that's fine. So to me, calling yourself a religion is a personal thing. I think a more interesting question in a sense is whether Hubbard believed it was a religion, and I don't actually think he did. In 1953, he wrote a letter to Helen O'Brien, a Scientology executive, where he was talking about maybe it's time to pursue the religion angle. I also got my hands on a document in the 1970s around the time of those raids that I was talking about before, where he was talking about a legal defence fund and maybe we should set up a non-profit legal defence fund, and he's talking about how that would work with the church mock-up. These are his words. I spoke to a documentary maker called Charlie Nan. He had a fascinating conversation with Hubbard off camera, where he said Hubbard admitted, this is in the 1960s, that Hubbard admitted that it was a scam, that it was designed to make money, and that he likened it to fly fishing with his father when he designed lures with his father. And he would design these lures to deceive fish, to catch them and to wheel them in. So I don't think Hubbard believed it was a religion, but if a Scientologist tells me it's their religion and that's what they believe in, I don't have a problem with that. It then leads, though, to a broader question, and also the 1983 High Court decision found Scientology to be a religion. But I think there's a question mark about whether all religions, some people would say whether any religions, should have tax-free status. And Nick Xenophon has been talking over the last 5 years about bringing in a public benefit test, that if you're a religion and you get tax-free status, that you have to prove that you work for the public good, that you had a dedication to charitable works. And I think the Church of Scientology would very much find it hard to get over that bar if such a test was brought in and retain a tax-free status in Australia.
Please join me in thanking Steve Cannane.
Thanks, Sophie. Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.